Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, saluting Earth Day on April 22nd with an ongoing commitment to help offset carbon emissions with sustainable harvesting of Missouri forests. Details at choosewood.com.
Welcome to St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jonathan Ahl. Today we're discussing details of the package killer cold case from the 1990s, when a man abducted and murdered at least 3 women from South St. Louis. This man is known as the package killer, and the 3 murders remain cold cases nearly 30 years later. Joining me in studio to talk about this is reporter Ryan Krull, who investigated the details of these cold cases over the past year. Also, cold case detective Sergeant Joe Burgoon and Barb Stutt, the stepsister of one of the women murdered by the package killer. Ryan, Sergeant Burgoon, and Barb, thank you all very much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Do you remember hearing about the package killer in the early 1990s? You can call us at 314-382-8255. That's 382-TALK. Or you can send us a tweet at STL on air or email us at talk@stlpublicradio.org if you'd like to get in on the conversation. Also, today we're going to be talking about these cases, and they involve murder and sexual assault. Some of the details may be upsetting to sensitive listeners. Ryan, let's start with you. You spent more than a year looking at these 30-year-old murders. For those people who may not remember them, can you encapsulate what they were and where it stands now?
Sure. For a year throughout 1990 into 91, a little bit over a year actually, 3 women, or someone abducted and murdered 3 women, and they're all abducted from the same general area of South City, kind of around the intersection of Cherokee and Jefferson, more or less. And abducted them, murdered them. And I suppose what sort of makes this sort of unique in St. Louis criminal history is that all of the victims were found in different parts of sort of the hinterland of St. Louis City, like O'Fallon or Lincoln County. And they were found along highways, Robin Meehan between 2 mattresses, Brenda Pruitt and a trash can, and Sandy Little in a sort of homemade box. So the sort of act of leaving the women in these different, receptacles, for lack of a better term, is why the few people who know about this case refer to the killer as the package killer.
And there were a couple of suspects identified, but nothing that came close to an arrest. And where has it just kind of, from the public perception, has it just kind of fallen off the radar?
Yeah, I think you could say that it was, and I think definitely Barb and Sergeant Burgoon could speak to this better than I could, but in just reading the news coverage at the time, there was a decent amount of it, a lot of front page coverage in like the Post-Dispatch in 90 and 91, and then it just kind of dropped off a cliff. It just sort of disappeared and was never really mentioned in print media again, at least. And I think, as someone who's lived here pretty much my whole life, I had never heard of it, and I think it's totally accurate to say it's just kind of completely fallen out of the city's collective conscience.
Sergeant Burgoon, how common is it to solve a cold case decades after the crime was committed?
Well, the main thing is you have to have evidence, physical evidence. And on these cases, there wasn't hardly any evidence at all.
And is that because of the state of decomposition and if I'm reading the reports correctly, the state of decomposition and the fact that they were so scattered?
On the Robin Meehan, she was found after several days, so she wasn't in decomposition yet. Okay. So that's our best bet.
And people may think about things like DNA testing and that kind of thing. That wasn't as refined and as something that was as available back then.
No, they didn't start till 94, 95 with DNA.
So what are the odds of a case that's this old with this little evidence ever coming to any kind of conclusion?
Well, there's a possibility. That's the way you have to look at it. It's been tested, and they always DNA is so many rapid changes with DNA. So they can retest and retest until there's a problem where you use it all up, and then after that you don't have anything.
What kind of evidence do you think would have to happen to break this open, where there would really be a substantial thing? What kind of evidence would law enforcement need to make significant progress on this?
I think that would be the DNA.
Barb, I thank you very much for coming in and talking. I imagine even this amount of time later, it's still difficult to talk about the loss of your stepsister.
It is, and a lot of it had to do, with the fact that being her family, we just never heard anything. The last I heard anything official was from her mother-in-law, and that was about a month after she was found. So since that time, we've never heard anything about the investigation. I didn't know who to contact about it. With all the rapid advances with the internet, of course, I would try doing Google searches on her name, on, the Cherokee murders, because at that time, that's what they were calling it, was the Cherokee murders. And, I never could find anything. And so when Ryan managed to contact me out of the clear blue, it was just such a shock. And it is amazing how much, you don't really think about it day to day after 30 years. And now suddenly I think about it every day again. And I do have to say I'm just really excited that Ryan came forward and wanted to do this piece on them and, show the world that they were more than just dead bodies found on the side of a road.
Before we get too far into this, can you tell us about Sandy? Tell us about who she was, what your memories of her, some of the things that make you happy when you think back about her.
Sandy was a party girl. She was the life of the party. Everybody that knew her just loved her personality. She was very fierce and protective of our younger sisters and brothers. She, didn't have a problem standing up for them. She would fight anybody who even looked at them wrong. But other than that, she just loved to laugh. She was a person that, she was just happy all the time. And even when life wasn't going her way, she didn't let things stop her. She did what she had to do to survive. So, I was her older sister, and she lived with me a couple of times when she was a teenager. And, we got very close during those times. When her mom and my father got married, she was about 3. And when she turned about 5, they moved down to southern Missouri, and they lived there until my father passed away. So I didn't see them as often when they were younger, but once they came back to the St. Louis area, I was pretty involved with their lives again. And so when she went missing, my stepmother let me know that she was missing. But at first, I didn't seem to be too concerned about it. But then time went on and nobody had found her, and then then they did find her finally. And even at the time, I got more information from her mother-in-law than I did from my stepmother, because my stepmother just wasn't really given information, and even if she had been, she wouldn't have really been able to understand what was said to her, because she has a mental problem, and so. I think they probably really just dealt with her mother-in-law at that point, because that was somebody that they could talk to and get information from. Plus, Sandy was living with her at the time that she went missing.
Ryan, what made you look into this?
Sure. So I just sort of happened upon it. I was looking through old copies of the Post-Dispatch on a database, as one does, right?
As one does.
And basically just happened to sort of see in the early 90s that there was these headlines about this serial killer, which is very loud headlines and that kind of thing that really kind of got your attention. And I was just reading the coverage just sort of as in just something that's intrinsically interesting. Then what stood out to me was that the story, sort of like what Barb alluded to, it lacked a resolution. There was no end. There was a few suspects here and there, but no one was ever arrested or no one was at least ever charged. So that just got me curious that, this really, big news event, this horrendous acts of violence, how could there not be some kind of resolution, or at the very least, how could there not be some awareness of it today? And put those two things together, and I thought, I should take a deeper dive into this.
Did you come to any conclusions on why you think that it kind of fell off the public's radar?
That's a really good question. It's hard to say for sure. I mean, I think on some level the fact that it was three women, or at least two of whom did have drug problems and were sex workers. Two categories of marginalized, individuals that they fell into both those categories. I think it was easier for the public to just kind of write this one off and not have to worry about it. And I do think that probably had something to do with the way it kind of slipped out of the public's conscience.
Sergeant Burgoon, what do you think? Why this people stopped thinking and talking about these cases?
Well, originally it started out, it was a Lincoln County case, and they came down to our office in homicide. After it took her 4 days before she was identified, and then we went, make a notification with Robin Meehan's mother, and then we'd start working that case of what we could. And Lincoln County was kind of shorthanded. They only, it was a small department, and the Highway Patrol assigned a sergeant, Don Bazzelli, to us. So we had like a task force put together, and then we start working on that case and trying to find out, as much as we could. And then we were also on the streets talking to the working ladies out there, see if they could help anything, help us with anything.
And so why do you think maybe that after the initial media coverage of this that people lost interest and they stopped talking about it?
It wasn't a high-profile case in a way, with the victim. Every victim's a victim, and some people just didn't want to get involved, or they didn't know. These are strangers. These are type of people. They don't talk. They don't brag about what they do.
And in fact, one of the victims had almost no family that could be traceable or contactable.
Yeah, Brenda Pruitt. I really quickly, just as a quick aside, I should give a quick thanks and a shout out to Stephanie Daniels, who did a lot of research for the story, a lot of the reporting, and I definitely want to thank her for that. But yeah, she and I tried really hard to find anyone who may have even sort of a tenuous relationship, like a second cousin or something like that, of Brenda Pruitt. We just couldn't find anyone. I know at the time, in the early 90s, Brenda Pruitt's parents were already pretty old, I believe.
Yes.
So, in all likelihood, they've passed away. And the only really thing that's mentioned in any of the news coverage I found about Brenda was that her family just didn't want anything to do with the media, that I think some Post-Dispatch reporters came to their house and were turned away. But I mean, yeah, if anyone's listening who knows, the Brenda Pruitt who died at the age of 27 in 1990, by all means, reach out. We'd love to tell her story a little bit more fully.
We need to take a quick break, but then we'll be back shortly to continue this conversation. You're listening to St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio 90.7 KWMU. Welcome back to St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jonathan Ahl. We'll return to our conversation about 1990's package killer in a moment, but first, here are some of the stories our St. Louis Public Radio newsroom is following today. A Major League Soccer spokesman said Friday that MLS officials would not announce the next two expansion teams during the week of the All-Star Game, as league officials previously said they would. St. Louis soccer fans who've been eagerly awaiting the announcement will have to wait a little longer. And the St. Louis Department of Health and the Division of Corrections are providing hepatitis A vaccinations to inmates at the city's two jails. Outbreaks of the contagious liver disease have occurred across the nation, and people in jails are among the most at risk. Join St. Louis Public Radio this afternoon for local and regional news, and throughout the day at our website, stlpublicradio.org. Now back to our conversation with Riverfront Times contributor Ryan Krull, who has investigated the details of these three cold cases from the 1990s. Also joining the discussion are Sergeant Joe Burgoon, a detective who worked on these and other cold cases in St. Louis over the past few decades, and Barb Stutt, the stepsister of one of the women murdered by the package killer. Let me start with maybe a more difficult question. There were three murders. Are there more, and will we ever know?
Joe, you want to take a stab at that one?
Well, the FBI has a program called VICAP, Violent Criminal Apprehension Program. And what it does is looks at unsolved homicides with a sexual nature. There's also sexual assaults. And you submit those. You make out there's online, and you put the facts of the case in there, and it does a search. It searches nationwide for similar crimes.
But I mean, at this point, if there were other crimes by that same individual, do you think they would have been linked to them?
The problem is with that program is some departments use it, some departments don't, and that's a big problem. All over the country, we have cases like this. You never know if there's similarities, a lot of similarities and things like that. But that's one tool we do have, and we try to use it.
So, Sergeant, I think a lot of our perceptions of serial killers are very much shaped by TV shows and movies, especially TV shows. It seems like crime dramas with a serial killer aspect have ballooned in the last 20 or 30 years. One of the things that a lot of people believe is that serial killers never stop. They just keep going. So this guy must have had more victims. What do you think about that?
It's a good possibility he did. We don't know. Even though we try to put the word out, but we have here, the FBI was cooperated with us with the behavioral science and the VICAP program, where they were going to be involved if there was another victim found. What they were going to do was just leave the body where it's found. We had permission with the medical examiners from St. Louis County, and the area region, and they would have their people come in here, the lab people plus the law enforcement here, and collect the evidence and process it. But we never had another case. Did he move on? We don't know.
Ryan, can you talk a little bit more about the connection between sex work and cold cases? Because that's definitely a possibility, one of the reasons that these victims have been forgotten and their cases not as actively pursued.
Sure. So what was really helpful to me and illuminating was talking to a Dr. Kenna Quinnett, who's a criminologist at the University of Indiana in Indianapolis. And she points out that there's a lot of sort of things that make it harder to solve a murder when the victim is a sex worker, and also the fact that even though in general, people who are victims of serial killers, serial homicides is dropping, across the country, it's dropped a lot less in the past decades for sex workers. So more and more, if you're a victim of a serial killer, it's more than likely, or it's very likely that you are, a sex worker, just because they're such a sort of vulnerable occupation. But yeah, so she points to this idea that, or she writes really well about this idea that basically because of the kind of the precarious nature of the work, someone might disappear for a few days, and people who know her, but that won't really necessarily raise any alarm bells with people who know her. It could be that maybe she got arrested, right, for soliciting, or maybe she, found someone and they ran off for a weekend or whatever, that kind of thing. These things happen, so it can delay the reporting of a disappearance, or it can, and also there's also this idea that sex workers might, just for the sort of nature of their work, be hesitant to contact law enforcement to begin with. So whenever the victim is a sex worker, there's just a lot, more difficulties in the case.
Well, let me be more direct.
Yeah,
Do you think that the public cared less about these victims because of their background? I mean, if these three women had been nurses or lawyers or social workers or something else, do you think that the public interest in trying to find their killer would have been higher?
I mean, it's hard to say for sure, but that's the nature of counterfactuals. But you have to think that would be the case, right? That if it were nurses or lawyers or whoever else, most any other occupation, that the public would have been more engaged, more interested in the case. So going back to Dr. Quinnett, for instance, she says that oftentimes, the police, they want a victim is a victim, just like Sergeant Burgoon says, they want to solve the case. But at the same time, the police are part of society. They reflect society. And there's just some folks that society seems to have an easier time writing off than others. And I think that's also, I'm obviously not going to criticize like another journalist, but I do think that sort of plays into why like the news coverage would just basically say this person, Robin Meehan, Sandy Little, was a sex worker, or the term they used was a prostitute, and a murder victim, and then the papers just kind of left it at that. And I think that sort of maybe tacitly kind of gives the public writ large a sort of permission to just not worry about this, or to feel like this is someone else. You don't need to worry about that, which is problematic, obviously. And I think that is why both the case fell out of the public conscience, and probably also had something to do, or is a contributing factor as to why there was never a resolution.
And Barb, do you think that was one of the reasons why justice for your stepsister has been delayed, if not denied?
I do believe that. It's hard when you see it splayed across the front page that, this Cherokee Street prostitute was found murdered. And, it's when I was interviewed for the Southside Journal at the time, and at that time, I tried to tell them the kind of person Sandy was, because just like Ryan had said, I wanted to make people aware she was more than just a prostitute. She did that as a means to survive. She had a baby at home that wasn't quite a year old when she went missing, and she was doing it partly to help get money to buy him formula and diapers. Prior to that, she was doing it to pay her mother to stay at her mother's house every day. So, Sandy was very entrepreneurial, if you want, to find ways that she could make money quickly when she needed to. And that was, unfortunately, the method she chose. I know that some of her people that were interviewed had said that she was a big drug user. When she lived with me, she was not using drugs. She did drink a little bit, but and I do think she probably got into it somewhat, but I don't think any time that I ever saw her, she was never messed up.
Society is a little more understanding of sex workers than they may have been 30 years ago. Do you think that will help get more attention to these murders?
Actually, I think the fact that it's brought back out into the light, you had mentioned how sex crimes on TV are such a big thing. I think that because it's going to make people want to find out now, why wasn't this ever come to a conclusion of some sort? And so I really hope that that's exactly what happens, is that, people take a look at the fact that they were more than just prostitutes. They were young girls that had families and had children and had people that cared about them, and, they deserved to find justice.
There were two suspects that were identified. There were a number of persons of interest, but only two people who kind of rose to the level of a suspect. And Ryan, suspect number one, you chose not to name in your story. Why was that?
Well, after a lot of consideration, it just seemed unfair to name that individual, because talking to Sergeant Burgoon and other law enforcement officials who only talk on background, it seemed more than likely that, almost for sure, that this individual was not the culprit. But the curious thing is that speaking to a lot of the relatives and the immediate family of some of the victims, this person's name would come up again and again, and there seemed to be something that sort of seemed to be a tension between those two ideas. The idea that the police could kind of rule this person out talking to me, but in the people who probably care the most about this, the families of the victims, this was the person whose name he did it, and I didn't. It was a tough thing to think about as a reporter. I didn't know exactly how to deal with it, so I guess sort of writing about this individual but not naming them, I guess it was sort of a compromise.
Sergeant Burgoon, can you share with us maybe what about suspect number one made the police say, we're pretty sure this isn't the guy?
Well, we were able to get hold of his car. We had his car towed in. We got a search warrant, and they processed it. We didn't find anything in there tying it to any of the victims. When Sandy was found, he was out in California, sleeping in a park in a car. When the police out there were watching him all the time, but he'd been there a while, so he didn't have time to deposit Sandy alongside the highway. So we kind of eliminated him on that. After Robin Meehan, we had him in quite a bit on that case. And then when Brenda Pruitt was found, lo and behold, we come to work in the morning, and there he is sitting there waiting for us. So he knew we were going to be coming talking to him again, and he had an alibi where he was at and everything. He had some mental issues, and that's how his attention came to the police, because police got a call down in the area where he lived at in February, and it was bitter cold, and here's a woman running up the street nude, beating on the door for help. So he had to have something had to scare her that would do something like that, and so we were aware of him, but there wasn't any evidence to charge him.
Suspect number 2, Ryan, you did name Frederick Brown, who is in prison for an assault that's shockingly similar in a way.
Yeah, it's basically identical to the other 3 victims, with the exception of the victim in that case, which was in 1993, was abducted from the Illinois side of Mississippi. I think it was East St. Louis. And yeah, I did name him, but because I did that, I wasn't going to name him if I wasn't able to get something from him. Like his, for lack of a better term, his side of the story. I wanted him to be able to say, I listed basically the sort of admittedly circumstantial evidence against him in the story, and then I also emailed that to him in prison as well and said, well, what do you say about this? And then I printed his reply in the paper in the story.
And let's get to his reply. It is very interesting because one of the things that he told you was they shouldn't be looking at all 3 of these from the same person. It could have been more than one. They should be looking at these individually. Was Sergeant Burgoon, was that a thoughtful revelation, or was it someone who might be guilty trying to throw you off the track?
Well, it could be. We knew it could be more than one because, each victim, there was a mattresses. It takes more than one person possibly to have to handle that. And the same thing with Brenda. She was in a trash can. And those are pretty heavy when you got a body in there. It'd take more than one person, to possibly have to handle that.
So there could be an accomplice.
There could have been.
Could the murders be completely unrelated? Could it be that someone happened to kill 1 or 2, but not all 3 of these women, and just dispose of their bodies in similar ways?
Well, the FBI, when they looked at it, and they reviewed each case, and they were of the opinion it was one person. It was the same person doing these.
Barb, there are 2 suspects. You know their names. What do you think of from your perspective as an advocate for your stepsister, whether one or both of these men might be involved?
I had only heard of the second suspect from Ryan. I had never even heard, but like I said, I stopped hearing anything at all after about the first month. But during that month, the first suspect was brought to my attention by Sandy's mother-in-law. She wholeheartedly believed it was him. She knew that he had been in California when Sandy's body was found, but for some reason she had it firmly implanted in her mind that he was 100% responsible. I don't know why. She never shared that with me. But as soon as he said the name, I said, that's the one that I was told about.
Well, and Ryan, you said that all 3 of the family, or the families that you were able to contact, knew of this guy and his name. In what context was it? I mean, I know you want to protect his identity, but in what context did they know anything?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So my understanding, I think Sergeant Burgoon can correct me if I'm wrong, is that he seemed to have something of a sort of known history in that sort of Jefferson Cherokee area. So I think he was known to some of the folks in that way. But
like a neighborhood ne'er-do-well that.
I think that would be putting it mildly, but yeah, we can go with that. And I'm not, just to be blunt, people, like Sandra Meehan, Chris Day, who is Sandy Little's child's father, they were, within a few minutes, this person's name came up, Chris Day, for instance, is maybe like the third sentence he said to me was this. If you heard this guy's name, he did it. But again, talking to Sergeant Burgoon and some other sort of law enforcement sources who wouldn't go on the record, I guess wanted to err on the side of caution and not print his name. We can always print it later in another story, and I will say I tried to reach out to this individual to no avail.
Sergeant Burgoon, to wrap up our conversation today, what happens next? I mean, do you just sit and wait to see if this new round of publicity gets somebody to remember something or suggest that they know something and wait for new evidence, or is there much else that can happen at this point?
Well, they started the major case squad and that. They got together last year and they started reviewing everything, trying to see if they could retest evidence and things like that. So that's where they're at on those. Yeah. There was one other thing though. There was a minister. Robin's mother got hold of a minister. They had a memorial service. Barb, do you remember that? There was a memorial service for all three victims. And the minister was saying, remember them when they were young and they were innocent and happy. You think of remember them that way, not what happened, with drugs and things like that where, that it just takes over their lives. But we'll pay, any information comes in, we'll pass it on. It'll be investigated.
I want to thank our guests for joining us today. Ryan Krull, Riverfront Times contributor, assistant teaching professor in the Department of Communication and Media at the University of Missouri St. Louis. Retired St. Louis Police Sergeant Joe Burgoon now works cold cases for the department, and Barb Studd, stepsister of Sandy Little and one of the victims. Thank you all for being here today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, saluting Earth Day on April 22nd with an ongoing commitment to help offset carbon emissions with sustainable harvesting of Missouri forests. Details at choosewood.com.